Hey there, hockey fans. Happy New Year and welcome to my 2021 Jack Adams predictions video in which I talk about who's going to get the award for the NHL's best coach this upcoming season. Now, I've already made award videos for the Rocket Richard, for the Norris, and for the Vezina, so I invite you to check those out if you haven't already. And of course, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing down below. Click the notifications bell. Stay in the loop because I'm putting out hockey content on a weekly basis at the very least. So, my friends, let's take a quick look at this, all right? We're going to examine the last 10 winners of the Jack Adams, and we'll see if we can spot any trends here, okay? So most recently, we had Bruce Cassidy. Actually, just look at the jerseys to get the coaches if you can figure those out. So Bruce Cassidy won it in 2020 with the Bruins. The season before, it was Barry Trotz with the Islanders. 2018 was Gerard Gallant of the Vegas Golden Knights. 2017 was John Tortorella with the Blue Jackets. 2016, again, Barry Trotz, but with the Islanders, with the Capitals this time, 2015, Bob Hartley with Calgary Flames. 2013 was Paul McLean with the Senators in the shortened season there. 2012 was Ken Hitchcock. He came in after 13 games for the St. Louis Blues, and he won the award that year. And then 2011, we had Dan Bylsma with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So if you really look at how these guys actually were awarded this trophy, first of all, your team has to be in the playoffs. All 10 of these teams, or all 10 of these seasons, that coach led that team to the playoffs. So that is definitely a criterion I want to stress here. There were a couple of moments in which these coaches led the team to a President's Trophy or a record-setting year for that team. And also, there's the chance that if you're able to end a playoff drought, and I checked this out too, okay? It's been over 30 years since a coach won the Jack Adams multiple times with the same team. So that's already going to kind of eliminate a couple of these coaches here. So I'm going to go team by team, coach by coach, and kind of make the case, or what would make that coach and that team get recognition at the end of the season, the regular season too. This doesn't factor in actual playoff performances, so do keep that in mind, okay? So we're doing this alphabetically this time. So first of all, Dallas Eakins of the Anaheim Ducks. Now, I myself don't think this is likely. The Ducks would have to qualify for the playoffs, and I know that the bottom of that division is pretty weak, but nonetheless, I think the Ducks aren't quite prepared to take that next step yet, so I don't see Eakins making a case for this. Rick Tocchet of the Coyotes, kind of similar position, a weaker team in that division. I think it's possible, a little less likely given some of the talent that the Coyotes have forfeited or lost in this offseason here. But they were basically at the top of the Pacific Division in December of last season, so they played a lot better until they got Taylor Hall, strangely enough. I think they have the goaltending to get them to the playoffs and secure that fourth spot. But it would also hinge on them getting more than just one guy scoring 20 goals. So I'm not as confident as I might be with one or two other teams in that division. Bruce Cassidy won the award in 2020 with the Bruins, and they had a great year there. They won the President's Trophy, and so I don't really see him repeating back-to-back. I don't know what it would really take for Boston, for him to get that sort of recognition again. Ralph Krueger with the Sabres. Now, the thing here is that the Sabres, we like some of the moves that they made in the offseason. They got Eric Stahl, but here they are in the East Division playing against the Bruins, the Flyers, the Capitals, Islanders, Rangers, Penguins. I just don't see it happening this year for Buffalo, and it definitely saddens me to say that, but I got to be realistic here. Jeff Ward with the Flames, I think that's a possibility. The team was very strong with him last year in relief. 24-15-3 record with him. I'm not too crazy about Calgary's roster, but I still think that they're going to be in contention at least for a playoff spot, but I don't know if that's going to be enough to get Ward recognition for the award. Next up, we have Rod Brind'Amour of the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, I believe that 2 years ago, I predicted him to win the Jack Adams. I don't think he did, but Carolina got into the playoffs for the first time in quite some time. So I think Brind'Amour's got a strong case again this year. I look at their division, I think of the Lightning without Nikita Kucherov. That might open the door for the Hurricanes with the emergence of Aho and Teravainen and Svechnikov and company and Slavin and Hamilton on the back end to possibly challenge for the division there. If they win the division, I could almost say right now that Brind'Amour would be a finalist. So I like his chances going into this next year. And of course, they're starting to produce some household names when it comes to star talent out there. Jeremy Colleton with the Blackhawks, I think this is pretty unlikely. The Hawks were already one of the weaker teams in that division before the Doc injury and Taves potentially being out for a while. It would take this team an insurmountable sort of comeback in a sense. They would have to make the playoffs without those players, or at least temporarily without those players. And I honestly just don't see that happening with the goaltending that they have right there. Next up is Jared Bednar for the Colorado Avalanche, and I think this is certainly a possibility here. The team is maybe in that year where they're ready to put everything together and actually meet these, the potential that we think that this team has. They're playing in a very weak division, so I think they're going to cruise to at least second in the division, if not first. And that would mean that they would possibly have their best season as a team since 2001 when they won the Stanley Cup. So I think Bednar's got a very strong case there. John Tortorella for the Blue Jackets. Now, he won the award 2 times, once in 2017 with Columbus and once in 2004 with Tampa Bay. Now, I almost think that Tortorella should have been in consideration last year. Or you could have argued he could have won it just with how he's able to maximize the talent of his players. I mean, everybody thought Columbus was going to finish last when they lost Panarin, but that was not the case. They were strongly in a playoff spot. The thing is that with Columbus, I think they would have to probably contend for the division to give Tortorella even more recognition. So I don't quite see that happening this year. They're still going to be a very good team. I wouldn't be surprised to see them back in the playoffs. Next up, we've got Rick Bowness for the Dallas Stars, and I think it's kind of unlikely here because he already showed what he's capable of doing. Like, his impact was at its highest, perhaps by leading that team into the Stanley Cup Finals. So I don't quite see it this year. They're going to be going at it without Bishop and without Seguin. So I'm not as sold on Dallas. I think they're still certainly in the playoff conversation. Don't get me wrong, but is that enough to get Rick Bowness consideration for this award? I don't think so. Next up, we have Jeff Blashill for the Red Wings, and I don't see it happening this year either. Detroit made some nice moves in the offseason, but a lot would have to happen. This team would have to be somewhat in playoff contention for Blashill's name to be in the conversation, so that's a no from me there. Next up is Dave Tippett. He was the 2010 winner with the Arizona Coyotes, and I think there's a possibility, but I still think it's fairly unlikely. With the Oilers last season in his first year with them, Tippett and the team was very consistent, one of the more consistent teams in terms of their record over the course of the season. So I don't know if that's going to play to their advantage in this Canadian division right there. I'm not as sold on their goaltending as I am with other Canadian teams. So I don't think it's going to quite happen that they find themselves in division consideration. But with McDavid and Draisaitl, maybe anything is possible. Next up, we have Joel Quenneville, who won the award back in 2000 with the Blues. I still think it's pretty unlikely with this Panthers club. They just lost Dodonov and Hoffman. They still haven't proven anything when it comes to defense and goaltending so much. When I look at Bobrovsky's season last year, I think he'll bounce back, but I don't know if he's going to do enough for this team to prove itself, considering they have the Lightning, they have the Hurricanes, the Blue Jackets, the Stars, even the Predators. I think those teams are superior to them, you can argue. So I just don't see it this year for Coach Q. Next up, Todd McClellan with the LA Kings. I think there's a possibility here. That certainly is based on how the team finished last season. I think they won their last 6 in a row before the season shut down. The thing is with the Kings, I still don't think their roster is all that impressive. So it would take that chemistry to kind of resurface this next season for them to be in contention for that 4th spot. I'm not so sold on it versus, I don't know, Arizona could be in that spot, and there's another team I'll talk about in just a little bit. But I wouldn't count it out of the picture entirely. Next up, I'm going to talk about Dean Evason for the Wild. Same division as the Kings this year. The Wild, to me, they still have a couple of players who have potential but haven't had the NHL experience to really convince me that they can be that 4th seed out of the division. I'm talking about Kaprizov, I think that's how it's pronounced, and Kakkonen. So I'm not feeling Minnesota all that much. They have some good depth pieces, but altogether enough to give Dean Evason consideration? I don't think so. Next up, we've got Claude Julien with the Canadiens. He was the 2009 Jack Adams winner with Boston. I think there's a good possibility here. Over the offseason, they made some pretty good moves, and this team has surprisingly a lot of good depth. They don't have like one stud, absolute standout, elite player. I know Shea Weber has been that in the past, but I'm talking about the forwards and defensemen right now. Of course, you got Price in net, you've got Alain in net. I think this team has surprisingly enough to maybe contend for the division there, so I like Julien. I like his chances here. Next up, we have John Hynes for the Predators. I think this is kind of unlikely given that Nashville has been in a playoff spot for the past several years consecutively. I like some of the moves that they made in the offseason to kind of stay in that picture, whereas I thought maybe in the past they would drop off. But I think they still can contend. But nonetheless, I don't see them finishing any higher than at the most third in that division. So for Hynes, I don't think he's going to get consideration for the Adams, not that much. Next up, we have Lindy Ruff for the New Jersey Devils. He won the award back in 2006 with the Sabres. And I think this is kind of a similar situation with Buffalo. The division, the rest of those other 6 teams are probably a cut above the Devils, although the Devils finished pretty strongly last season. So I think that the Devils will be competitive. I don't see them as a playoff team. I have to do a real deep analysis to make a decision on that eventually, but I don't quite see it this year. We might be looking at their status as a playoff contender next year, potentially. Next up, we have Barry Trotz, who won the award in 2019 and also 2016 with Washington. I don't really see this happening this year because he was part of a facelift for the Islanders in the 18-19 season. So he would have to he'd have to win the President's Trophy running away to get, I think, the award in 2021. So I don't see it happening, but the Islanders always find a way to prove me wrong. Next up for the Rangers, David Quinn. I think there's a possibility here because the Rangers were playing very good hockey in the second half of this past season, and I think that they might have been on pace to actually legitimately qualify for the playoffs and not just be, one of those 8 teams that got in after the fact. So I think it's certainly possible. Shesterkin, if he continues to play like he did last season, this team is certainly in a playoff spot contention-wise. So I think last year wasn't quite a flash in the pan for this team, but again, they have to make it out versus some very tough competition in that division. Next up is DJ Smith with Ottawa, and I think it's unlikely that he gets consideration. I think the Sens are going to be a better team, absolutely. I like some of the signings that they made in the offseason, and of course, they have all this young talent that we'll be looking forward to watching over the next few years. But again, in the Canadian division, it's going to be real tight between probably 4 or 5 teams, and the Senators just aren't one of them. Next up, we have Alain Vigneault for the Flyers. He was the 2007 winner with Vancouver, and actually, I believe he was my pick to win the Adams before the start of last season because the Flyers were my pick to win the Stanley Cup. Now, with Vigneault, it's unlikely here because the Flyers, kind of like the Islanders, they might be right there in contention among the other teams in that division, but I think that they would need to go to a way high level, win the President's Trophy for Vigneault to get consideration here. You got to take into consideration, as Shannon points out on his channel, the Flyers in recent years have had an up year and then they've had a down year the next year. And that trend has continued, I think, through the last 8 years or so. So I'm not as hot with the Flyers as I had been maybe the last season. So I'm going to say probably not. Next up, I have Mike Sullivan for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and I'm going to say maybe. It's kind of sad that he didn't win the award last year, considering this team just absolutely surged when half of their team was seemingly injured at a given point in the season. So I want to say, don't count out the Penguins, even though it seems like they're kind of losing some of that mojo that they had in their cup years until they miss the playoffs. I'm not going to count them out, and Sullivan's going to be a driving force behind that especially if they're going to be facing any injuries. So I want to still definitely tip my cap to him. I don't necessarily expect Pittsburgh to be, top 2 in that division, but if they make it back into the playoffs, maybe Sullivan has a case there. Next up, we have Bob Boughner for the Sharks. I think this is somewhat unlikely. So with the Sharks, and I'm a Sharks fan, so I have my bias here. I think there's actually a chance that they finish 4th in that division. When compared against the Kings, Ducks, Wild, and Coyotes, I think maybe the Sharks are still the best case to get that 4th spot, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree. The reason why is because basically their forward group, even though it's lacking in depth, in terms of 60-point players on that team over the course of a normal season, I think the Sharks have it versus the other 4 teams that I just mentioned. So I still think that they could end up securing that last playoff spot there. But even if they do, it's the same core of Sharks players minus Thornton and Pavelski, I guess. But you still got Kane, Couture, Meyer, Hurdle, Burns, Carlson. How do you not make the playoffs with a roster featuring those players? So I don't see why Boughner would get credit for that, even though the Sharks had a terrible year last year. Next up, Craig Berube with the St. Louis Blues, and I think this is pretty unlikely. The Blues, to me, when looking at their roster, they might actually take a little bit of a step back next year without Jake Allen. And Torrey Krug is, a good signing nonetheless, but you're losing Pietrangelo, one of the best defensemen in the league, and you're losing, your captain, although O'Reilly's going to probably do pretty darn well for himself, I would think. But Berube already experienced the cusp of his career with the Blues. I would think, taking them from essentially the basement, halfway through the season almost, 2 Stanley Cup champions. I called that before that season started, by the way. So I don't see it happening this year for Craig. Okay, next up is John Cooper. And kind of similarly, I don't see it happening this year. He's already achieved everything he needs to achieve in 2 seasons with the President's Trophy and, record-setting year right there. And then the next year, exercising the playoff demons and just dominating all the way to a Stanley Cup championship. I know they don't have Kucherov this season, but they would have to have they'd have to win 45 out of 56 games for him to get consideration, I think. Next up, Sheldon Keefe with the Maple Leafs, and I think this is a pretty strong possibility here. The team with Sheldon Keefe last year, 27-15-5 record. I think that they're in strong contention for the North Division, so that definitely helps his case, and obviously the Toronto market, that's going to strengthen his case as well. Good mix of some grizzled veterans that they brought in. TJ Brody coming in, that's going to solidify the back end somewhat. And of course, the emergence and sort of as we get to the prime of careers for players like Marner and Matthews as well. So I think Toronto might put it together this year, and Keefe could definitely be recognized for that. Next up, and I also think that he's a strong possibility, is Travis Green with the Canucks. He has helped this team get better in each of their 3 seasons with him behind the bench. I think that the roster is still very strong. They brought in Nate Schmidt, Braden Holtby, Jacob Markstrom going elsewhere to Calgary, but I still think that with what we saw in the playoffs, JT Miller, Elias Pettersson, Quinn Hughes, this team I think could surprisingly contend for that North Division. So Green, I'm going to keep him in contention for sure. Next up is Pete DeBoer, and I think this is actually pretty unlikely given that Gallant in the club's first season, which was just 3 years ago, they just shot themselves out of a cannon and won that division going away. So I don't see DeBoer getting the team necessarily back to that level with Colorado right there as well. So I'm hesitant to put DeBoer in consideration there. Next up, Peter Laviolette with the Capitals. And I want to say that it's possible, but think about it this way. Bruce Boudreau and Barry Trotz have won the President's Trophy with Washington, and they've won the award already. So considering that Ovechkin's still on the team from that era, Backstrom, Kuznetsov for in a sense, Carlson in a sense as well, I don't really see that happening with Laviolette. Granted, it could happen. They could still win that division, definitely, but in terms of really standing out among the other teams in that division, I don't know if that happens, I don't know if that's going to give him the award necessarily. And lastly, Paul Maurice for the Jets. And I'm going to say this is a possibility. Now, I myself am not counting on Winnipeg to be a playoff team out of that competitive North Division, but Winnipeg proved me wrong last season. So I don't want to doubt him entirely. Maurice has the expertise, experience, and he's had some recent successful years with the club. Then again, you've got Connor Hellebuck. Is he going to regress like he did in 2019, the year after being a Vezina finalist? Or is last year's Hellebuck the guy who's going to put the team on his back this year? Excuse me. Anyway, I've stated my case for all 31 head coaches in the NHL. So let's narrow this down to 3 finalists and a winner. So I'll name my 2 finalists and then I'll give my winner. So finalist number 1 that I have is Rod Brind'Amour for the Hurricanes, due to the fact that you might actually see the rise of several household names on that roster. This team, I think, could compete for the division title with Kucherov out for the Lightning and the potential for a Stanley Cup hangover for Tampa. So Rod the Bod and the Caniacs, I think there is certainly potential for them to make a lot of noise this season and for Brind'Amour to be considered for the award. My next finalist is Jared Bednar for the Colorado Avalanche. I think this team could just absolutely surge ahead in that weak West Division alongside Vegas and really realize the potential that we know this team has behind them. So I think that they could have one of their best years in franchise history, up there with their cup-setting year of 2001, and this team is going to be so much fun to follow over the course of the season. So I want to make sure that he gets a finalist recognition there. And my winner for the 2021 Jack Adams Award for the best coach in the NHL, I'm going to give it to Claude Julien for the Canadiens. As I mentioned earlier, this team has a sneaky, scary good roster. I think they put it together this year. They're going to get into the playoffs legitimately. They're not going to be, tacked on as one of the last 8 teams or anything like that. Don't be surprised if they're in a division race a little bit with the Maple Leafs and I think the Vancouver Canucks. And Claude Julien, he has a proven track record with Boston, and he's, obviously had some success with Montreal as well. So I think he's going to take home the hardware in 2021. But those are just my thoughts. I want to know your thoughts down in the comments below. Who are your Jack Adams finalists? Who is your winner? Be sure to sound off down below, and let's see what you all come up with. All right, guys. Well, anyway, stick around for our next video in the series. It's going to be the Hart Trophy for the MVP of the NHL. Can't wait to discuss that and get your impressions on that. Make sure if you haven't already, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't below, and make sure you can also check me out on Instagram and Twitter as in the video description. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. This has been Nick. Happy New Year once again, and I'll catch you later. Ciao.